power tensions between major global powers and African nations are once again in focus after reports that South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa will not be attending this year's G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains. In France, whilst Pretoria has suggested external pressure, particularly from the United States, may have influenced the decision. Well, French officials insist that the guest list reflects broader strategic choices, including invitations to countries like Kenya. The development raises important questions about Africa's place in global decision-making, shifting alliances, and whether geopolitical tensions are beginning to reshape who gets a seat at the table. Well, to help us make sense of all of this, we're now joined by Dr. Terence McNamee. Thank you very much indeed. Always good to talk to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Peter.
So, is it, I mean, South Africa is saying it's US pressure for the G7 not inviting South Africa. The French are saying, no, we're just inviting Kenya this time around. Where do you think the truth lies?
Well, almost certainly the United States has applied pressure on the French government. I wrote about this issue at the end of the last G20 in Johannesburg. And I mentioned at the time that South Africa is going to face a tremendous challenge because, when the UK takes over the G20 in 2027, it's not going to be business as usual because unless the US-South Africa relationship improves, as I wrote then, the United States is going to put pressure on the UK to continue to exclude South Africa. And in this particular case, all countries are having huge challenges dealing with a highly mercurial and erratic Trump administration. But what I think this shows is that, ultimately, South Africa is not the hill that any of these countries are prepared to die on. So notwithstanding their own troubles with the Trump administration, they're always going to choose them because they're such a significant global player. So I'm almost certainly there was some pressure on Paris.
Why is America so powerful that it can influence, I mean, six of the top economies in the world?
Well, it's again, I think we have a tendency to assume that these other countries think about South Africa more than they do. As I said, it's just not a hill that anyone is prepared to die on. They have their own challenges in dealing with the Trump administration, which they are all bilaterally, and in the case of sort of Europe and NATO, collectively trying to deal with the Trump administration. So to some extent, South Africa is a bit of a sideshow. So if it is the case that the Trump administration threatened a boycott, it doesn't surprise me at all because Macron and Europe and the rest of the world, they have their own issues to work out with the Trump administration, and getting face time with him, particularly on their home territory, is simply more important than defending South Africa. So this is just the reality of geopolitics and the reality of the way the United States and the Trump administration is operating globally at the moment.
And is the US's beef with South Africa just about Israel?
No, I think from the beginning, there's a whole confluence of issues that are coming together, as I think I've mentioned on your program here. Yes, of course, there's the ICJ case, but what could be more potent at the moment than South Africa's long record of collaboration, indeed, with the regime in Tehran. I mean, we had military officials visiting Tehran recently. We had the exercises in Simonstown. I mean, if you talk about a kind of red rag to a bull, and add that, of course, to the issues about the United States culture wars and how the white genocide myth plays into that. So there are many, many reasons for South Africa to be in the sights of this Trump administration. So I would expect more of this. And as I've been saying for quite a long time, we are nowhere near even just arresting the slide in this relationship. And just like all countries, South Africa has to think innovatively of how they deal with this highly mercurial, erratic Trump administration.
Might incidents like this contribute to a realignment? The fact that these these other countries are feeling pressure from the US, and we were just doing a story a little bit earlier on suggesting that countries like the UK wanting to rethink their dependence on US support, that these kinds of tensions being raised by Donald Trump might be forcing a bigger question for these other countries, saying, "Look, we can't be held to ransom by the United States. We really need to start rethinking." Could this be something happening?
Peter, of course, it's absolutely 100% happening at the moment. I mean, I'm from Canada. 75% of our exports go to the United States, but we've seen how this has rendered us quite vulnerable in terms of this level of integration and dependency on the United States. But these things, these changes can't happen overnight. So all countries are looking at these relationships, which they once had a number of assumptions about, which have now proven to be a bit more hollow than they imagined. But again, these things can't happen overnight. So I think everyone is rethinking about, relationships. Of course, Mark Carney's famous speech at Davos when he talked about middle powers and the necessity to sort of club together. So I think everyone is thinking about the strategic landscape going forward, even post Trump administration. But for the time being, you simply just have to manage this chaos. And in the question of South Africa, how are they going to manage this situation? Because the Trump administration would appear, and I think this is an important point to raise, Peter, is that I thought that perhaps the administration is simply too focused on other matters to give an issue like South Africa much thought at the moment. But the fact that officials clearly did put some heat on Paris to make this change suggests that, the Trump administration really is heavily invested in, frankly, punishing South Africa, marginalizing it and isolating it until, frankly, it gets what it wants from that relationship.
Could the relationship between South Africa be repaired under a Trump administration, or do we just put our hands up and say, you know what, until there's a new guy in the White House, South Africa US relations are probably not going to improve?
No, I can't. You can't throw in the towel. Similarly, with the relationship between Denmark and the United States, or NATO and the United States, the issue of Greenland is going to crop up again and again. I don't think the President Trump has completely given up on that ambition. Similarly, in the case of Canada, we see these sort of mini eruptions time and again in terms of the relationship. But I think we have to look at what other countries have done as examples for South Africa. And one that I know well, certainly in Canada, is we were the target of all kinds of baseless assertions about the amount of fentanyl that was coming over the border into the United States. And in reality, the United States Customs and Border officials said only about 0.2%. So it was obviously a completely baseless assertion. However, we did make certain policy changes that address the wider issue in terms of drugs and drug use and the flow of drugs. And that removed the fentanyl issue as a point of contention between Canada and the United States. So South Africa has to think more innovatively about what they can do. And again, my own view about, for instance, the white genocide issue is that actually South Africa has to change it up. They're giving too much oxygen to this issue. I mean, no one believes it is true. We have to move on and think more about how you deal with this administration in a way that can at least, as I said before, arrest the slide, because we're still nowhere near that. I mean, where's the envoy? Where's the ambassador? I mean, apparently these things are still cooking. But the fact that there's no one there who's really navigating, stewarding this relationship is a big problem.
And that's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much. Always good talking to you, Dr. Terence McNamee.
Pleasure.
So that's Dr. Terence McNamee, Senior Fellow at the Montreal Institute for Global Security, making sense of South Africa being, inverted commas, snubbed by France at this year's G7 summit taking place in June.
Je, una jambo